And to get on to a different application of esoteric astrology, or even possibly regular astrology, is that just like people, countries are sort of on different signs, and they have their own sort of astrological influences.
Yes, the book Destiny of the Nations gives a chart, gives out charts. He gives out the soul and personality ray and the sun and ascendants signs for the a lot of countries. So I don't have it with me. It's on my bookshelf. I won't go get it, but in that book, Destiny of the Nations, you can look up a number of the major European and countries, or a few others, and see what sign is their sun on and what sign is their ascendant on. What's their rising sign? Now that's a difficult thing to figure out, and it's for instance, in the case of the United States, it doesn't match the 4th of July, right? If
That's
use,
not the true birthday. DK's
right,
information doesn't match what we normally think of the U.S.'s birthday.
well, he doesn't say what the birthday is, but if you use that birthday with a tropical chart, you don't get, he says the United States has Gemini sun with Aquarius rising. The rising is a time, so that has to do with, like when certain events happened. So what event he's using is not clear. But if you use the 4th of July, it's Cancer, not Gemini. Now, someone mentioned to me that tropical, that's sidereally, it is Gemini. But DK, he doesn't say what he's using. He doesn't say if he's using tropical or sidereal. Now, that's an interesting point. I should probably go through that table and see if in all cases, using kind of standard dates, if you get what he gives for the tropical sun versus the sidereal sun. I think it's a little bit more esoteric than that, and I'm not sure we can know. I'm not sure that there's a physical outer plane event that you can use to say what.
Yeah.
So
but it does give out this information that the U.S. is on these signs. And so you had actually written an article about, it was Uranus and Taurus, right?
Right. I started
and
writing.
how every time these coincide, there's like a major conflict in the U.S.
Yeah, I wrote that article. I was initially trying to figure out, like, and prove to myself if it wasn't the 4th of July, then what was the event? And I started looking at that, and knowing something about astrology, I surmised that, well, let me look at what was going on and where the sun was and where Uranus was, to see if if there was something going on earlier. And what I was actually starting to do is look at the effect of a Uranus return on a particular point in the chart, because I figured Uranus returns. Well, Uranus on the sun is always the fairly major event. And so I was looking at historically to see, could I find the point in Gemini and then work out the date and see what it was. And so I go, but what I ended up doing as a result of that is I started looking at, well, wait a minute. Uranus was, I was looking at what happens when Uranus enters Gemini. The sign of the sign that the DK says is the sun sign of the United States. Now, one of the things that's interesting is DK doesn't talk about orbs ever. Now, an orb in astrology is how far away two planets have to be in it from exactitude of an aspect. So if you're talking about the conjunction where both planets are in the sky, then is the planet, depending on how wide the orb that you give is, it's not considered in conjunction if it's beyond it. So if you say the orb for a conjunction is, let's say 5 degrees, different people use different things for different planets. But if you say it's just 5 degrees, if they're 6 degrees apart, then they're not considered in conjunction. If they're right on top of each other at the same point in the sky, then they're considered in conjunction. DK never does that. And he never talks about orbs. And he seems to imply that things are, and this is sort of akin to Vedic astrology, that things are in aspect when they're in the sign. So if two things are in the same sign, they're considered conjunct. If two things are in two signs on the same element, then they're considered trine, right? If they're on one of the cross, if they're on two of the arms of the cross, then they're considered anywhere on the arm of the cross. They're considered in opposition, conjunction, or square. So then I began to realize, like, well, what happens when Uranus enters the sign of Gemini? And I started noticing a peculiar pattern. So when Uranus, if you look in the article on the blog.
Yeah, I'll put it up on the screen for people afterwards.
Oh, okay, yeah, you can do that. Or I could share.
No, I'll just put it up later. People should be able to see it now.
They can see it now?
Well, in the future when I release this. It's up, it'll be up on the screen.
Okay. So if they look at that article that I wrote on my blog, it's called Thoughts on Astrological Cycles, the U.S.A. and War. I started looking at, well, what happens the moment that Uranus enters, Gemini? And then I noticed, it happened, we got into the American Revolution in 1774. And I used this technique called the graphical ephemeris, which makes it easy to spot when things change signs over long periods of time. But that got me thinking about, well, what happened when it was in the sign before? So what I ended up doing, and this is one of the things that really has to be done more of in order to prove the efficacy of astrology, is to do this kind of historical research that says, well, look, every time this planet goes into this sign, similar things happen almost to the day. So that's the type of research that will prove that astrology really works.
And so can you walk us through those conjunctions and the major events that happened in the US?
Well, what you see is that what I started looking at is what happens when Pluto goes into, when Taurus goes into, what happens when Uranus goes into Taurus, and then what happens when Uranus goes into Gemini. And I did it over since from the 1765 to now. And what you begin to see is that when Uranus is in Taurus, you see certain things emerge having to do with the kind of Taurian disposition. So Taurus is typically characteristic of self-assertion and arrogance and stubborn, prideful self-assertion, really. Is how you could sum up the lower expression of Taurus. And every time you see in the United States chart, Uranus go into Taurus, what you find are all the issues start coming up in the life of the country that will lead to a battle when Uranus gets into Gemini. So what you find is that like all the things that led to the American Revolution were taking place when Uranus was in Taurus. So all the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townsend Act, all having to do with economics. So England was doing this sort of selfish, arrogant assertion of its economic rights. It wasn't giving the United States any representation. And that's where the whole thing of taxation without representation came from. And Franklin and others were in England trying to get some representation, and the king was saying, no, take a hike. We're not gonna
Hit the road, Jack, before the road hits you.
right. And so finally in 1774, it was the Intolerable Act. And what happens in 1774 and basically the middle of the year, roughly June, is Uranus goes out of Taurus into Gemini. And basically what happens in 1774, the First Continental Congress convenes. And in response to the Intolerable Acts, in September of that year, so now Uranus is firmly in Gemini, and they start preparing to declare independence and everything else. And in April of 1775, only a few months later, Uranus is now in Gemini. You have the Battle of Lexington, and basically the American Revolution starts. So and then I thought, okay, what happens next time? Well, and I look at the next time, and the next time is from 1850 to 1870, and you have Uranus going into Taurus in the 1851, and there you see all these things having to do with states' rights versus national rights, the issues around slavery as a form of economic activity, the attempt to block states coming into the Union by the South, like California, for instance, because they didn't want any anti-slaves. They didn't want too many anti-slave states involved in Congress so that they would lose their rights. And so you saw all this arrogant self-assertion and economic assertion around the idea of slavery and as an economic activity. And that went on until Uranus enters Gemini in 1858. And what happens in 1858? You have the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which is a series of 77 debates. And those things were basically considered were what led to the Civil War. A lot of historians will tell you that those debates caused people in the South to basically decide that that they were going to have to succeed, and that Lincoln was well, it raised him to national prominence, but it brought him into prominence. It got rid of Douglas, and then it was only in 1859 that you sort of have the Johns Brown raid and basically the start of the Civil War, really, around the whole issue of slavery. So pretty much to the month, these things happen. You have this stuff leading up to it in Uranus and Taurus. Well, they show you what's going to be the basis of the problem, and then it's pretty much just within months of it going into Gemini, you have things that basically turn into a war. And so then I thought, okay, let me look again. When's the next time this happens? Well, next time it happens is 1933. Uranus goes into Taurus. And what happened in 1933? Well, FDR came to power and Hitler came to power in Germany. Both leaders were elected into office in that year. Both leaders then spent the entire period of Uranus and Taurus rebuilding and taking their countries out of the depression by work projects and just rebuilding their whole country, all the road building and tree planting and dam building, things that went on in the United States during under FDR in the 30s, completely transformed the life of the United States. All the infrastructure. Now remember that word, infrastructure, because it comes into play in current present cycle. And so But it was essentially infrastructure. If you wanted to use one word to describe it, what was happening when Uranus was in Taurus? Well, the infrastructure was being completely regenerated and revised for the United States and in Germany and maybe in other countries too. I don't think it's national exclusive to the US, but US is an example of it. And so then what happens when Uranus goes into Gemini? When did it go into Gemini? Well, here's a date that you'll probably recognize. Uranus entered Gemini in 1941. It touched Gemini like in September-ish of 41. And what happens right after that? Pearl Harbor in December. So and basically the Japanese are already planning this, right?
Yeah.
And it was, it sort of bounced back out, retrograded out, but by March of 41, we're fully into World War II, sorry. It was in there until 49 when NATO ratified, was ratified. So, which was sort of the end of the, kind of in a certain sense, the end of one war and the beginning of a Cold War to some extent, and you had all kinds of things happening. You had the World War II played out, but other things happened. You had, the Marshall Plan. You had the UN partition of Palestine into Israel. You had Pakistan splitting off from India. You had the whole North-South Korean thing. All these things happened when Uranus was in Gemini. So then that brings us to present day, and Uranus enters Gemini in 2018. And what happens then? Well, Trump starts the trade war with China, and we get into all these economic things. We see all these Supreme Court battles, Kavanaugh. We see issues over the pandemic. We have Trump constantly talking about infrastructure, but because he's so egocentric and can't really do anything besides worry about himself, he never managed to pull any infrastructure projects off. And it wasn't able. He talked about it, and had he actually carried out it, executed on it, he would have easily passed it, and it probably would have been a big feature of his administration. But he never managed to pull it off. He bibble-babbled about it a lot, but he never managed to pull it off because he was, just too involved in his personal battles. However, once Biden got into office, that was the first thing he did. Once again, Uranus and Taurus, infrastructure. People were talking about it over the whole period of time. Eventually, it got done.
And because Taurus is a kind of very materialistic sign. And
Well, it's an earth sign, and it often has to do with money and economic life of things and economic well-being, and it seems to transform these kind of things. Uranus is a very transformative and disruptive planet. I would say transformative, not disruptive, but it tends to change things for the better in the long run. And so, and then when it's in Taurus, it has to do with the economic life. But we see all kinds of other issues, and we're still in Uranus and Taurus. It won't leave Taurus until we get 2025, right around the time of the presidential election, which is a little spooky. Because every time it gets into Gemini, we get into a war. So God knows what kind of war we're going to get into. But with all the issues that are on the bubble here with, presidential power and presidential immunity, and whether the, theft of election, and the Electoral College, and the Supreme Court, and, interpretation of the Constitution, there's a lot of room for problems.
Yeah.
And on top of
that's
that,
the thing some people keep saying is, we're eventually going to get to another sort of civil war if
well, there's a lot of people actively wishing for it.
Yeah.
Down south in particular, which they're crazy, because all you have to do, take a trip to Gettysburg battlefield, just to remind yourself of how many people in the days of muskets and cannons died. it's like 50,000 people died all in one field.
Mhm.
What do you think's going to happen when you got all these people running around with 50 cows and their little, their whatever guns they got? It ain't going to be pretty.
So
And
what, finish your
so,
thought.
like, I would not wish for a civil war.
Mhm.
Better hope that it stays on the mental
Yeah.
plane and that we battle this thing out in the courts.
Nor would I. But so what do you think, what advice would you give to people if they'd like to avert a kind of physical conflict or civil war? Because we have, it's not written in stone. It's the energies come down and it's kind of how you use them that determines that.
Well, for starters, I'd say educate yourself about the facts.
Hmm.
Because a lot people are being whipped up with lies. Like, for instance, the lie that the election was stolen. It wasn't stolen. If you think it was, then you haven't read the news. Go out and study the fact that there's been over 60 court cases, with none of which, with the exception of one, found anything material. Go out and study that. See if that's real or not. It is, but Fox News is lying to people about it. Go read Liz Cheney's book. Great book, by the way. Let me get it. I can't push it enough. I don't agree with her.
Well, I think
But
whatever your viewpoint, investigating facts and being willing to engage in dialogue and people that have a different opinion, I think is part of what's needed.
Oath and honor.
Gaps.
Here's a hardcore right-wing Republican, if that's what your ilk is, who, was right there and who sat on the committee and who, like, listen to what she says about all these people who are out there, who she will tell you are lying, and who know they're lying, and who are lying because they're cowards, and because they want to power. And she mentions names: Jim Jordan, McCarthy, McConnell. She tells you everything that happened that she saw firsthand, and things that they said to her, and then things that they said to her later. And read it, do your homework, and find out that you're being lied to. So if you're going to go to war, at least go to war for the right reason. Don't, at that end, the lies are not in.
I push back a little bit. Is the January 6th committee had a bunch of information they kind of didn't put out there because it didn't fit the narrative they seemed to go for. But I very much,
man, tell me that.
Yeah, but I very much agree that people should look into it for themselves and not just, get angry at people or have really fixed opinions based on, well, somebody told me, so it must be true. Look into it for yourselves.
We have a big problem in that there's misinformation, a lot of it, lies. That's, by the way, the instrument of the Dark Lodge. They use lies, they use distortions of truth and spiritual reality. So people are being manipulated through lies.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not going to say that these people are bad. I'm going to say they're patriots. Most of these people are good patriots. They're just not using their thinking caps. So they're being misdirected. They're being turned into a weapon, and their ignorance and their inability to think clearly is being taken advantage of. But so go out and form yourself. It's not an inevitable conclusion that it happens. I don't want to say that it's happening. What I'm saying is that all the writing on the walls is not good. Now, the interesting thing is the other thing that we're seeing during this period of time are all the problems with the United States Constitution. The United States, people in the country have this sort of glamorous idea that the Constitution is this sacred document that shouldn't be touched. And, we have to go in and read the tea leaves to try to figure out what these old guys from almost 300 years now were thinking when they wrote this, this freaking obscure passage that's totally irrelevant to some extent to modern living. And
well, the Constitution has provisions in it where it can be amended, and it has.
Right, that's what I'm suggesting. It needs to be amended. It needs like a radical rewrite. It needs, well, not radical, but there's a number of things that need to be fixed.
Well, I disagree that it needs a radical rewrite also, but one thing I think.
I don't mean radical rewrite. What I like, electoral college, that needs to go. It should just be a popular vote. there are issues around executive privilege and executive power that needs to be addressed directly. There are issues around Supreme Court and recusal and all kinds of things. They should expand the court. Make it a larger group. Give them term limits. Don't be a lifetime appointment. Why no one should be sitting on there for life? Give term limits. Have it 7 years or refresh everything. There's
Well, one thing I think a lot of people, both on left and right, agree with, which is unfortunately not gone anywhere, is term limits for Senate and Congress.
Sure, term limits. We have them for president. We should have them for the Supreme Court. So, the whole selection process should be changed, right? It shouldn't be subject to political appointments, right? Right now, it gets completely tangled up in the Senate, depending on who runs the thing. Where really what it should be is, well, if it's less critical for starts if it's not a lifetime appointment. It's less critical for starts if you have more of them, and really, like a lot of other countries do, it should be appointed by a national body of legal scholars or judges. Like the judges on the federal bench should have some kind of election from amongst their own ranks for who gets appointed. They're in the best position to know who would be best qualified. So you could have some kind of system like that where the country's judges on the federal bench choose who the Supreme Court justices are via some kind of election, where presumably people, the judges who are recognized to be really good, win. There should be rules for recusal. I mean, there's a lot of there's things like this that need to be refined in it.
Well, I think it's important, whether people agree or disagree with your ideas, that they're worth thinking about, and it's worth being open to different opinions and considering things. And that builds that kind of bridge between people with different perspectives. You can at least say at the end of the day, well, I listen to somebody and he seems to be sincere. You might disagree on some things, but at least, there's a real person there who cares about the country and things.
There's an interesting woman, her name's escaping me right now. She writes for the Washington Post, and she points out that you don't have to eliminate the Electoral College to make it more representative. She points out that it used to be that the number of congressional districts, which is the number of congressional districts is how many electoral votes there are. Yeah. So there's 435 congressional districts. So as the population of the country expands, the congressional districts they got fixed at some point because people worried about the size of seating in the house in the chambers. But she points out that the Constitution allows for it, and it had expanded for a couple hundred years, and we could just go back to an expansion. And so if you doubled it, for instance, the number of seats, you would reduce the population in each congressional district and make it more representative. And once you do that, each congressional district would be smaller, and presumably the population that was in it would be more representative of that district.
That's an interesting idea.
And so if you don't have to eliminate the Electoral College entirely, you could just make the more districts smaller, and she shows how you could easily fit that number of people into the building, and it would be more representative. So we'd still have the Electoral College system, but we'd have one that's more representative because there's smaller districts representing this. So you wouldn't have this disproportionate weird thing where some states are very large. They have a small but they have a small population, and so they have this sort of outsized influence. Like they get 2 senators. I would argue they should get rid of the Senate. Actually, it's analogous to what they did in England, where they neutered the House of Lords. So it's just the House of Representatives. In England, it's the House of Parliament that has the main influence and does everything, and that's like the representative body that our system is loosely modeled on, the congressional system. And So when, all these issues are sort of up and in people's faces. So when Uranus gets into Gemini in 2025, we could have a war over it, or we could keep this up on the higher plane and take advantage of the fact that Pluto's in Aquarius, the sign in which the Constitution was written, and revise the Constitution to reflect all of the problems. And I think that will happen. I just hope it's as a result of, not as a result of a war. Now, if we have a war in this country, or something like, some kind of internal disturbances, you can be sure that lots of state actors will take advantage of the chaos. You'll have problems with Taiwan and China. You'll have Russia doing stuff. We'll be too self-involved to help Europe with Russia, and God knows what Russia might do. So I could easily see how if this doesn't go right, you could have things breaking out all over the place, not just here, and then it could precipitate another world war. Chaos here could precipitate it. Well, a lot of other actors would take advantage of the chaos here and our inability to get our shit together and to focus on what's going on outside because we're too self-involved.
I think the different planes of existence and the sort of esoteric constitution of man come into play to sort of illustrate the energies. Like these energies come down, they first precipitate to the mental level. And if they were resolved there, they kind of come down harmoniously to the rest of things. But if they don't come through and get resolved on the mental level, it comes down to the emotional level. And if it doesn't get resolved there, eventually comes down to the physical level, and that's where you have a physical conflict.
Right.
So it's better to have a shouting match than it is to have a physical conflict, but better than a shouting match is better to have a kind of logical reason back and forth debate. And
Right.
If we can keep it on the emotional level, great. If we could keep it on the mental level, even better. There'll be some sort of conflict, whatever it sounds like, but if we can deal with it in more intellectual or wise ways, it won't spill over too much into a physical plane, probably.
Yeah, and the symbolism. The interesting thing about the symbolism of Gemini is that it's the sign in which the two brothers battle. So that which must decrease. There's a battle to see which will win, but eventually that which must decrease, the more spiritual, the more materialistic, less spiritually evolved point of view, has to give way ultimately to the more correct spiritual point of view, the one that's greatest good for the greatest number. And
well, so far that seems to have been the case. The Revolutionary War, the sort of freedom won out, Civil War, freedom again won out, and the World War II freedom won out. So hopefully this time we'll be on a similar path or similar outcome.
yeah, and I found this interesting statement of the Master DK about Taurus, about Uranus and Taurus, and he says that the task of Uranus, hidden in the depths, is to awaken and evoke the intuitive response of Taurus to an ever-increasing light, until such time that full illumination is achieved, and also the development of the spiritual consciousness, substituting these higher soul aspects for the lower form reactions. So that's what you see kind of coming up before our eyes during Uranus and Taurus. And if you look at some of in the article, I list the events.
Yeah, and I'll have the article link below for people to check.
Yeah, the major events that were coming up, but you could, if you can understand it in terms of invoke the intuitive response, right, to the vision, a spiritual vision, one, right human relations versus the sort of assertive, selfish, narrow point of view that only helps a small group, right?
As Spock would say, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the
right. And that's what and also the Constitution, we have lots of principles spoken about in the Constitution, but we don't always live up to them. So
yeah, that's
under these types of times, we basically get forced to consider why we're not living up to them, and hopefully want to, take another higher turn of the spiral to try to, which sometimes requires battle, so that we do more properly represent our higher ideals.
Well, hopefully those constitutional principles we're not living up to can be sort of set right. That was a segment from my interview with Cliff Ribaudo. If you liked the video, please leave a like on it and consider subscribing. And if you'd like to watch the full interview, you can find it right here.